Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sara Spinks.
Welcome back to Safeguarding Conversations. Today we're unpacking what's widely being called the mobile phone ban in schools. But as usual, the headline oversimplifies what's actually a much bigger policy shift.
Yeah, it really does. So recent government updates and strengthening guidance messaging in 2026 have significantly reinforced expectations. So the Department for Education now makes clear that schools are expected to prohibit mobile phone use throughout the school day as the default position. Lessons, transitions, breaks and lunchtimes. Anything different should be the exception, not the norm. So while it remains non-statutory, the direction of travel is now unmistakably clear. And where schools can come unstuck is assuming that this is just a behaviour tweak. It isn't really. And it's about safeguarding culture, inspection readiness, equality law and operational leadership.
And it's important to understand it sits within a much wider government strategy. So alongside the updated guidance, HM governments launched a national consultation on children's relationships with mobile phones and social media. And that consultation is exploring addictive platform design, stronger age verification, possible social media restrictions for young users, and regulation of emerging risks, including AI-generated harms. So this isn't just about behaviour inside schools, it's part of a broader national reset around digital well-being.
Yeah, and crucially, Ofsted inspection practice now make clear that inspectors will consider how effective mobile phone policies operate in practice when evaluating behaviour and culture. So inspectors will expect to see a genuinely phone-free environment if that's what school says it has implemented. So this has moved from guidance to paper, on paper sort of thing, to something that will be actively scrutinised.
Yeah. So let's look at the why this is happening. This guidance hasn't appeared out of nowhere. Schools nationally have faced safeguarding concerns linked to mobile phones, and that includes things like filming assaults or fights, sharing nude or semi-nude images, AI-generated sexual imagery, live streaming incidents, cyberbullying during the school day, grooming via messaging apps, and exposure to violent or extremist material. These are not hypothetical risks. They are real safeguarding incidents that schools have had to cope with.
Absolutely, exactly. And it isn't about distraction alone. I think that's really important. Under KCSIE, schools must take reasonable steps to minimise opportunities for harm. And if devices are facilitating abuse between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., for example, leaders are expected to respond.
And I think, we've got to be honest here because it's controversial. Some parents and staff strongly support phone-free schools, arguing they improve focus, relationships and behaviour, whilst others raise genuine concerns about safety travelling to and from school, emergency communication, young carers, mental health reassurance, independence and digital literacy. So leaders must be ready not just to implement a policy, but to explain and defend it professionally.
And that's why rationale matters. Ofsted won't accept because the government said so. Schools need to demonstrate what safeguarding risks exist locally, what behaviour or incident data shows, what consultation has taken place, why this approach fits this particular community. So inspection conversations, I think, will increasingly focus on that decision making. not compliance alone.
So let's move on to implementation because this is where policy becomes reality. The guidance allows phones to be brought onto site, but pupils should not have access during the school day. And I will say there are exceptions which we will come to, but this is the broad spectrum requirement. So schools will therefore need operational decisions. They'll need to think about lockers, sealed pouches, hand-in systems, or secure storage expectations. Now, each of those carries, cost, supervision, and staffing implications. And recent research suggests enforcement itself can take significant staff time, showing this is really a whole school system issue, not just a quick fix. And many schools are now extending these policies to include smartwatches and other connected devices, recognizing that safeguarding risks are no longer limited to mobile phones alone.
Absolutely. I think what's really key is that consistency is everything. If staff apply rules differently, you don't just have behaviour issues, you lose credibility. So from 2026 onwards, inspectors are expected to look at consistency of enforcement, clarity of expectations, staff confidence, governor oversight, and measurable impact. So I think what's really important is that policy must translate into lived culture.
And now we'll get to what I alluded to earlier. We're going to layer in equality law because under the Equality Act, schools must make reasonable adjustments. So that's really saying, a blanket, no exceptions approach that could be unlawful.
Yeah, and I think examples might include phone linked medical monitoring, for
Yeah.
example.
Which you do get
We do with
something.
children with diabetes, for
Yeah.
example. Yeah.
Which is hugely important because it does enable children to monitor their blood glucose levels without having to do the pinprick blood and whatnot.
Yeah. Communication or regulation apps for SEND children, for example, the accessibility technology that's needed by some pupils or
Yeah.
pupils with documented safeguarding or wellbeing plans. These are not loopholes, they are lawful adjustments. And I think decisions must be recorded and reviewed.
And they will have to be detailed. Those adjustments, as they're called, that does need to be specified in the policy. And it's about ensuring that where there are children with those exceptions in place, because what you don't want to get is a member of staff saying, "What are you doing with the mobile phone?" It becoming an incident and whatnot, and then everybody's saying, "Oh," and it spreads and spreads and spreads.
Yeah.
And actually, there was an agreed adjustment. So I think it's about ensuring that all staff on board know. And that can be really tricky, particularly if you think in a secondary school setting. That is really, really difficult to achieve. So there's going to have to be quite a bit of work done around this. There's also contextual safeguarding, isn't there? So young carers in some domestic abuse contexts, exploitation risk, and there may be court ordered communication arrangements. So, thinking about this policy and developing this policy, that does require professional safeguarding judgment, not just rigid enforcement.
Yeah, exactly. And the policy, must be firm enough to reduce harm, but
Yeah.
flexible enough to protect vulnerable children. And that balance is leadership work.
There's another important legal point, Sarah, that I think we must mention. We can't miss that out. Is that under the Education Act, authorised staff, and I do say authorised staff, can search for items prohibited by law or listed as prohibited within the school's behaviour policy. So I'm just going to make a quick shout out and note to everybody. If you want legal search powers related to phones, mobile phones must be explicitly listed as a prohibited item during school hours in your policy.
Absolutely. And staff must understand who can search,
Yeah.
when searches are lawful, the difference between search and confiscation, and proportionality. This is compliance territory here. And getting it wrong, that can create legal risk.
It does. You know, Confiscation also requires judgment. School leaders must consider safeguarding risks after school. So if you're going to confiscate a child's phone, you've got to think about all the other factors that by doing that, that might also be impinged on that. So it's, as I've said, safeguarding risks after school, medical reliance, as we've mentioned, caring responsibilities. So again, rigid enforcement without that professional judgment of that contextual element can undermine safeguarding.
And that really is the central theme. Safeguarding is, as we know, Sam, rarely black and white.
Yeah. So leaders should now be asking, is our rationale documented? Have governors been involved? Have parents been consulted? Are staff trained? Are adjustments recorded? And can we evidence the impact? Increasingly, inspection conversations will be focusing on the outcomes and impact, not just the written policy.
And I think it's important to state, this isn't about demonizing technology. It's about leadership. Schools must choose an approach that fits their safeguarding context and implement it properly.
Yeah. If you're going to be phone free, then update your behaviour policies, include smart devices like watches, etc. Build lawful flexibility, as we've discussed. Train your staff, communicate clearly, and monitor the impact.
Yeah, because ultimately, inspectors will ask one simple question: does this improve safety, behaviour, and culture? And if you can evidence that, you're on solid ground.
Absolutely. The safeguarding always comes back to thoughtful, defensible decision making. If you need support auditing your policy or preparing for inspection scrutiny, then why not check out our model policy that's available in the policy library? Thanks for listening.